Hi everyone, and today we're going to be talking about The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And there she is in her younger days, about the time when she wrote this book. This is not a quote from the book, but just a quote of hers that I like. The answers you get from literature depend on the questions you pose. And I think it applies definitely to this book and hopefully to the entire class as we've been talking about and discussing the different dystopian novels that we're reading this term. So where we last left off, we talked about the totalitarian state in which science and history were banned in Ayn Rand's Anthem. And again, Anthem is a shorter book, and it has sort of archetypal characters, meaning that these are flat characters that have one or two character traits, but they don't really seem like real people with real emotions, and it's almost told like a fable in many ways, with equality and liberty, falling in love and running away. And then in contrast to that, we looked at a scientifically advanced society with a strict caste system, people valuing entertainment and happiness, or fake happiness, over freedom of thought in Brave New World. And in Brave New World, in terms of characterization, we saw a lot of different types of people living under the same system. So Lenina and Bernard and Helmholtz and John, and even even a little bit with Mustafa Mond and the director of the hatcheries, right? You get a look at people in different sections of this type of society, so it's a little bit more in depth. But the Handmaid's Tale is based on a different type of totalitarian state. So in all of these books, you have extreme government control, but that extreme government control comes about in different ways. And we're going to talk a lot in this PowerPoint, and then in the next one where we get into some of the themes and symbols of the book, we're going to talk a lot about what a theocracy is, what history influenced the author, and then looking at Offred, the protagonist of the book. It's her story, it's her journey, and she's quite complex character, complicated history, emotions that seem realistic. We also have in this story women who don't just exist solely to give the male heroes a goal to obtain or a prize to win. Now, we talked about that in Anthem, where liberty is really there for equality to fall in love with. She serves no other real purpose in the story. She goes away with him, but she's not the one doing the scientific research, right? She's not the one really bucking against society's rules, other than running off with equality. In Huxley's book, in Brave New World, we have Lenina, who we get a few scenes with her just on her own, but primarily she is there for Bernard to pursue. She is there for Henry to date. She is there for John to fall in love with. And really, outside of that, does she have much of a purpose? Not really. In this story, and then later on in Matched, we're going to look at two female protagonists who have a lot more agency and who are forging their own paths as opposed to just following along with the men in their lives. This is just a quick recap of flat versus round characters. So flat characters, uncomplicated, again, like equality and liberty. Sometimes they remain the same. That's the same thing as being static, which is down. There we go. Same thing as being static. I don't know why they have that twice. Characterized by one or two traits, summed up in a sentence or two, cannot really surprise the readers because they are predictable. In contrast, round characters like of Fred in this book, like of Glenn, Serena Joy, the female characters in this book are complex. They don't have just one or two character traits. They don't just surprise us. They confuse us. We have to think about them quite a bit, and Just like real life. You can't figure people out based on one or two traits. So some terms. Theocracy describes who rules in a government. So in a theocracy, you have ecclesiastical authorities, that means religious authorities, or church authorities who stand in for God. So examples of theocracy throughout history over here. I've taken a clip from another scholar's slide here. There we go. Pharaohs who were believed to be gods. The Byzantine Empire was also ruled by an emperor who was the head of the church. The Catholic Church had the Pope. And even still today, Vatican City that is run, it is a theocracy. It's the center of Catholicism. So you have the Pope ruling and then the cardinals and the bishops underneath him. In Puritan times, in early colonial times, there were some settlements that were theocracies. Not all of them, and I think that's something that people get confused about. Some were secular societies where they had, they were based more in farming, and they had churches, certainly, but they weren't necessarily run by a church government. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about the Muslim world. Iran has a theocratic government and is under Islamic law. So the term totalitarianism describes how the state rules. So theocracy is talking about who is doing the ruling. Those are the people that are in the church or in the religious authorities. Totalitarianism is how the state rules. So subordinating all aspects of an individual's life to the authority of the government. And we can see that in all of the books we've read, as I said, except that in Brave New World, it comes out with the state controlling people through entertainment, through psychology, through hypnotism, through drug use, right? To pacify people through these things. In Anthem, we had a seemingly more oppressive government where people were, sent to jail for 5 years for stealing a candle, right? In the Society and the Handmaid's Tale, we're going to talk a little bit about how the theocracy is set up and how people are oppressed. And I would argue too that the book often is called a feminist dystopia, and it focuses much on how women are oppressed. But I think that men in the book are trapped in the same system and oppressing themselves in a way by oppressing women and by not having equality. There are both totalitarian and non-totalitarian theocracies. So a theocracy is not always subordinating an individual's life to the authority of the government. Some are also oligarchies, which we talked about before. That is where you have the rule of a few people. So an aristocracy where, a king and queen and then some nobles like dukes and duchesses and lords and ladies are ruling. Or a plutocracy, which is ruled by wealth. We also talked about a meritocracy, which is the rule by the intellectual elite, or the people who have the most merit. So in this book, we have a definite oligarchy where wealth and power are controlled by a select few. It's not clear exactly if there's it doesn't seem to be a dictatorship or an autocracy. Those are sort of the same term, meaning that there's one leader in those types of societies. But here in The Handmaid's Tale, in Gilead, we have a small group of people, the commanders, and to a certain extent their wives, who are standing in for God and claiming to know the will of God and how people should be ruled. So, some historical background. This it could sort of be seen as somewhat controversial, but Margaret Atwood has been pretty open about the fact that in the course of her life, she lived in East Germany, or near East Germany, rather, where there was a divide between East and West Germany. And East Germany was ruled by the communists, so she saw that happening. And then also we had a huge shift in Iran. So I want to give you a little bit of background of about what happened in Iran, and I want to state for the record, I'm going to link some things, because as I do for all of these PowerPoints, because I'm not a historian, so I'm just trying to give you a little bit of context for the book that you're going to read. And Iran has changed since then, but what we are talking about here is Iran in the 1980s, and it has changed somewhat since then. I'm not completely gone back to the way it was. So what did Iran look like in the 1960s and 70s? Well, prior to 1978, you had a Shah, and the Shah of Iran was, that was the leader, kind of like a king, if you want to think about it that way. And he was trying to westernize the country. So they had revenues from oil, and they had some economic growth. They also had high rates of government spending and inflation. And one of the problems as well was that the ways in which he tried to westernize the country were totalitarian, that he tried to impose things upon the people as opposed to just letting things kind of happen naturally. So what happened really is that you had people who did not want the change, were not ready for the change, and were kind of shoved into it. You can kind of think of, like, as a comparison, if people in the 1970s, let's say, when computers were just being developed, if they were told that now they have to carry cell phones and text everyone all the time, they would be confused, not really wanting to do that, right? Those kind of things. So the government, for a brief time in the 1950s, they experimented with parliamentary democracy. The problem was that in terms of how the United States saw it, and we got involved when we should not have, in my opinion. But the difficulty was that the person leading the democracy was anti-West, and he wanted things to go back to a more theocratic society. So using sort of that democracy to be voted in to then take the country backwards. And so in 1953, the CIA led a coup to overthrow the prime minister of Iran. And that is where a lot of our problems started, because we got involved in foreign politics that probably we should not have been involved in. So the Shah then reclaimed power, and his regime oppressed other political parties. So you have this situation where there is westernization and economic growth, but at the same time, a man who is oppressing people and trying to subdue them. The Shah put into place some of the westernized practices in the 1960s, banning the veil so that people were not allowed, at least for a certain period of time, to wear the veil if they were Muslim. Now, the problem with this is that many people wanted to wear the veil. They did not feel comfortable not wearing the veil because of their religious convictions. And so basically you have a number of women who sort of stayed home for several years, or who were not allowed really to be educated outside the home because of the ban on the veil. So he tried to expand women's rights in this way, but it backfired a little bit. After that, he allowed the veil to come back in because of the problems that were going on, but he expanded women's rights in a very positive way, ending extrajudicial divorce, which basically meant that men had to go to court to divorce their wives. Before that, a man could just tell his wife, I no longer want to be married to you, you are divorced, get out of my house, and the man had sort of all the power in that situation. He also raised the age of consent. The age of consent in Iran in the 1960s was 13, meaning that 13-year-olds could be married, and often not exactly by choice. So moved that up from 13 to 18, gave women the right to vote, allowed abortion in rape cases only, and restrictions were put on polygamy so that men were no longer able to marry younger girls and no longer able to marry many of them. These are some pictures from Iran in the 1960s, and you can see these are girls at a college studying. This is a group of men and women on a tour in college. You'll notice here no veils, right? Bare legs. Circle that. I guess I could circle her head too. No veils, bare legs. Here you have women wearing pants. And what basically happened is that Iran was expanding and modernizing. Much of the country was still traditional and conservative and rural. Several political parties banded together, so people who had been oppressed under the Shah began to oppose him, and thousands of students from religious schools took to the streets. So this was really originally a youth movement of people who were not the pictures that we just saw, but people who were in college and studying religion. We had a lot of also displaced people from the country who were now in the city, who did not like the fact that the country was having more liberal morals. So the youth and the unemployed agrarian workers, and also women. Women wore kadors, which are longer veils that cover the entire body, and held signs in protest. The leaders, so this is, and here are some women protesting. This is something that comes up in the book. How did women have this influence? You can see some of them are wearing the veil. This woman is wearing a longer thing. People here are wearing coats and things like that. But yeah, they're holding up signs in protest. They're shouting, they're chanting. And in the book, The Handmaid's Tale, a lot of this is reflected. So a return to conservative values was eventually enforced. And that enforcement came in steps. So it's not like the rights of women were taken away all at once. The rights for women were taken away sort of bit by bit by bit. Committees, I don't know if I'm saying that right. It just looks like committees. Committees were enforced the dress code of women. And you had actual fashion police, so other women many times who were more conservative out on the streets who would see a woman and beat her possibly about the legs or force her to go back home. In more gross cases of this, they would arrest the person if it was a gross violation. So if she was not wearing her veil right, if she was not, if she had a dress that was not quite long enough, if you could see too much of her skin, these types of things. So women were forced then to wear the hijab, the veil, and child centers and women's centers were closed. Family planning was abolished. The laws giving the right to divorce and vote were repealed. So they went back, almost like going back in time to before the 1950s when some of these laws started to be put into place. And this is Iran after the revolution. So you can see the great difference, right, in what the women are wearing here as opposed to, if I go back, what they are wearing in those pictures. A complete change. And extramarital sex and adultery were then punishable offenses. They were punished by fines, imprisonment, flogging, and sometimes execution by stoning. So depending on if the person was married, if they were single, if they were caught, how many witnesses there were, if it was a second or third offense, those kind of things. But basically, then Iran moved from this society that had been modernizing itself, with which, granted, it had more liberal values that were sort of pushed upon the people to a theocracy. So now in Iran's constitution, all civil, penal, financial, economic, administrative, cultural, military, political, and other laws and regulations must be based on Islamic criteria. That is a direct quotation, and that is how the country was ruled at the time. Now, they are sort of allowing some rights for women to come back in, but very slowly, and they are still on many lists for being civil rights, for having civil rights violations. And so I've attached for you guys in Blackboard an article about feminism in Iran, so you can kind of read about women's role in the revolution and then how they were sort of oppressed by the revolution after the Shah was removed from power. So what does this have to do with our book? Well, basically, Margaret Atwood sort of saw this going on, saw the changes to some of the to some countries that were under a communist regime, and she sort of said, what would happen in the United States? And I have a longer quote from her here, but she basically, these are some quotes from Margaret Atwood from an interview that Margaret Atwood did. She stated, "Keep in mind, I did not use any details in this book that have not already occurred somewhere in history. If you wanted to seize power in the U.S., abolish liberal democracy, and set up a dictatorship, how would you go about it? What would be your cover story? It would not resemble any form of communism or socialism. Those would be too unpopular. Nations never build apparently radical forms of government on foundations that are not already there." Now, that to me is important because we've seen that happen in the books that we're reading, right? They have chaos, they want control, and then they take that control too far, but it's never a system that wasn't there to begin with. So what does she mean by that? This is a quote, even though it's not in quotation marks, because it kind of follows from what she just said. Thus, in real life now, thus, China replaced a state bureaucracy with a similar state bureaucracy under a different name. The USSR replaced the dreaded Imperial Secret Police with an even more dreaded secret police, and so forth. The deep foundation of the U.S., so went my thinking, was not the comparatively recent 18th century Enlightenment structures of the Republic with the talk of equality and separation of church and state, but the heavy-handed theocracy of 17th century Puritan New England, with its marked bias against women, which would need only the opportunity of a period of social chaos to reassert itself. Moving from chaos to control. Like any theocracy, this would select a few passages from the Bible to justify its actions and would lean heavily on the Old Testament, not toward the New. In another interview, Atwood said, "No, I don't consider the people in Gilead to be Christians because they don't have at the core their behavior and ideologies." So one of the things I will say here is I think that Puritan New England is often mischaracterized. I think sometimes if you read the actual documents from Puritan New England, they were, in many cases, like with the Mayflower, they were trying to set up a more democratic society than the one that they had come from, at any rate. So when you have people coming on the Mayflower, do you have some, we call them pilgrims many times in our stories, but you have some religious people, and you also have some people who were on the boat, and they were allowed to live among the pilgrims, so that it was not just people in the Pilgrims Church alone, but people from outside of it. William Bradford writes about that quite extensively, including some things about the first Thanksgiving. Now, he also writes about some of the punishments that took place there, which to us would be horrifying. And in that sense, yes, they were more heavy-handed, especially than we are today. But what I think is interesting here are two things. Number one, that she's acknowledging that if you wanted to abolish things in the United States, you wouldn't set up something that wasn't here before. You wouldn't really be able to set up a collectivist society. Collectivism would not work in the United States. We have way too much individualism for that, right? But what you could do is twist the Bible and the biblical foundations of the country, twist them to your own purposes, which are used by politicians on both sides. You will see Republicans do this and Democrats do this. And what she says is the people are not Christians in the book. Just like many of the people who took power in Iran would not be really considered possibly true Muslims, right? That they're using the religious doctrines for power, not for worship. So the structure of Gilead in the novel is derived a lot from these types of ideas that she had. First, I've got these charts here for you guys. So the first thing is that I wouldn't have put the wives on here. I would erase them because I don't think they're really this part of this chart. So high class people, they have wives at home. They are married. Procreation is key. They wear black. Then underneath them, more men, the eyes, the angels, and the guardians. The eyes are the secret police. The angels are soldiers. And the guardians are soldiers that are of the state. So you have soldiers not at war who kind of act as police. Angels who are the soldiers at war. And then the secret police that's watching everything that people do, particularly the women. So men are at the top of this social hierarchy. There are also men not on this chart that are in lower level positions. And they are married to econo wives. We'll talk about what their wives do in a minute, but what their lower level positions are not entirely clear. Essentially, they're not part of the oligarchy. They're not part of this setup with the commanders exactly. But they are at the same time supporters of, sorry, my microphone. They are supporters of the state. So they're allowed to live. They just don't have as much money. What's interesting to me is that really, even though it's puritanical, you still have this very, oh, sorry guys, we talked about this before, where you have a hierarchy, right? Classifications of people. So the commanders and the police, it's a little $sign. The police, the eyes, and then the people below them, and then the women kind of at the bottom. So this is an interesting little drawing here of the different women in the Republic, and they are definitely in a hierarchy. Wives are at the top. They wear blue. Like the Virgin Mary, the daughters wear white until they are married. The daughters are the privileged children of the wives, or sometimes the adopted, many times the adopted children of the wives. But we'll talk about that in a minute. The handmaids wear red and they bear children for the wives. The Marthas wear green. They're older many times. They're infertile. They do the housework. And sometimes things like cleaning the streets and things like that. The aunts are in brown. They train the handmaids. They are also the people who sort of like the fashion police. They make sure that things run the way that they're supposed to run in the training centers, and the wives do the same at home. The Econo wives have multicolors because their husbands are poor. It sort of depends what role they take. They're a wife, but they don't have the same status as a wealthy wife. And then we have Jezebels and unwomen. Jezebels are lesbians, people who are attractive women. They're basically turned into prostitutes. Unwomen are women who would not go along with the system. They're exiled to work and die in the colonies, sometimes cleaning up after the war. It's not really clear whether, how they're in the war, but they are, and certainly cleaning up after it. And there seems to be some nuclear waste they have to deal with as well. So women who are sterile, women who are political dissidents, they're determined unwomen. Their identities are completely taken away from them. So you can sort of see a little bit the hierarchy here, but truthfully, it's, all these women are down here at the bottom. Jewish people, because this story is based on a group of people who are saying that they are Christians, Jewish people are treated a little bit differently. They're given the choice to return to Israel or to convert. So some of them decide to convert. Some of them are sent back to Israel. There's a possibility that the people who wanted to return to Israel were killed. There are some line or two about them being kind of dropped or left in the ocean, and it's not entirely clear what happened to them. People of color, particularly African Americans, are labeled children of Ham. Now that's an allusion to a biblical story where a man who commits murder is given the curse, children of Cain, really. I don't know why. Oh, Ham. Right. So there's a man in the Bible who is basically cursed by God, and some of the interpretations of that story hundreds of years ago was that the curse was that he had darker skin. And so in this Society of Gilead, people of color are basically relocated. They're removed to the outer territories. There are farms in North Dakota. Now, realistically, I don't know about in 1985, but even now, you're not going to be able to fit all of the people of color in North Dakota. In the 1980s, when this was written, you had I can't talk right now. I'm so sorry, you guys. When this was written in the 1980s, you had some interracial relationships, but not as many as you have today. So, the idea is also hinted at that possibly some of the people of color were killed, possibly that they are also at war, and possibly that they were maybe returned to Africa. I think that, it's interesting because the televised version of The Handmaid's Tale, if you've seen it on Netflix, if you haven't seen it, don't watch it until after you read the book, because there's a lot of changes and it'll just get confusing keeping things straight. But if you have seen it, it does have a multicultural, multiracial cast. And in some ways, that is a good update to the book, and I think a much more realistic look at what America looks like today. In other ways, I think it detracts from the message of the book, because the message of the book is that there is only room at the top for a certain very small number of people, and that small oligarchy, the small number of rulers, are not tolerant of anything. So they're not tolerant of religion, they are not tolerant of gender, they are not tolerant of race. And I think that part of the message is lost, but maybe we've moved beyond that. Quakers, Baptists, and other non-approved Christians are rounded up as well. So it's very clear that this is a fringe fundamentalist group that slowly grew and then took power. The actual story. So Gilead is the former United States, which has turned into a military theocracy. So you have commanders. The oligarchy is run, or backed at least, by the Eyes and the Angels and the Guardians. Offred is she is sometimes called. You could also pronounce her name of Fred, because that is her new name. She belongs at the moment to commander named Friedrich, and therefore she is of Fred. We also meet of Glenn, of Warren, etc. In this book, her name is never given. Her real name is never given. In the movie, they choose a name based on one line from the book, and similarly in the television show. And I think it is better that she is not named because of some of the themes in the story. But at any rate, her identity has been erased. Handmaids are only allowed 3 assignments. And if they do not have babies by the 3rd, then they are declared unwomen. So she is in her 3rd assignment. We don't know much about the first 2. And one of the reasons we don't is because now she has a brand new identity. And that part of her identity has been erased as well. So Fred, her commander, and his wife, Serena Joy, enact a sexual ritual with Offred once a month so that she might bear them a child. The story is told from her first person point of view. It's non-linear, and this is kind of important because the other books we're reading are very linear. Non-linear means that we don't start at point A and go from point A to point B and have kind of like, beginning, and then point B is the middle, and then point C is the end. That's a linear plot. A non-linear plot means there's flash forwards, there's flashbacks. We might be here and then go back here, right? We might be here and then jump forward a bit in time. So the reason that this is done this way is because it's her memory, and memory doesn't work in a linear way. You have things where your memory is sparked by something and you remember something from your past, right? So Offred describes bits and pieces of her life. The time before Gilead and the regime took over with her husband Luke and their child and her friend Moira. There were signs and signals of what was happening, but Offred sort of ignores these, and we're going to talk about that part of her characterization later on in the second part of this lecture series. Ignoring isn't the same as ignorance. You have to work at it. And she certainly did. She didn't ignore the signs. She really tried to almost be willfully ignorant and hope that what was happening was not happening. And then it was too late. So she tells of her life at the indoctrination center where she was brainwashed by the ants. She lost her will to fight against a system she never saw coming because she was trying to ignore it. And then we learn of her life with the commander. He is a hypocritical man who writes laws, denying ability to read, and then lets his handmaids play Scrabble and look at old women's magazines, Us Weekly and People and Cosmopolitan and things like that. So we get all of these 3 parts of her life. Her life with Luke, her life at the center, with some of the women who she became sort of friends with there, and then her life with the commander. And the science in this science fiction, that's a picture from the TV show version. The forward momentum of science has been truncated, and a return not just to religion but to superstition, which is something that we saw in The Savages of Brave New World, and we also saw it in Anthem as well. So a common theme here through some of the books I've tried to pick for you. This is sort of a second Dark Ages, and the superstitions, surrounding these sexual rituals that they have to perform. And you wonder whether the commander and the other rulers believe that these rituals will actually work. We only get things from Offred's point of view, so it's not entirely clear, but at least it would seem that some people believe in them. It's rarely mentioned, but the environment has a great significance in the novel, so that's something I'd like you to watch for. First, obviously, how science has been kind of erased and replaced with superstitions and phony religious rituals and that kind of thing. But what has happened to the environment? There seem to be radiation and chemicals in the air and water. There has been war, which seems that there's been nuclear weapons. There's also pollution, though, and irresponsible acts against nature. So the land is damaged, the people are damaged, and this is a theme throughout the book, the theme of complacency. You know, the complacency of using up stuff so that there's pollution. And then also so that is one type of sin. And then the other sin of actively destroying things like in war. The social reasons. So one of the things too is that the environment seems to have had an effect on people, and the way that they're damaged is that many of the women are infertile. It's also implied that many of the men are infertile, but because of the Gilead structure, men are never blamed for being infertile, and they really are not allowed to be called infertile, only the women. Social reasons that the birth rates are low. And Atwood talked about this, about how many times people who were white and wealthy were not, and still are not, having as many children. And so you have lower birth rates among people in that class, which in this book, they get worried about. And they worry that people of color are, there are too many of them and not enough of us, right? But there's also scientific reasons. As I said, the women are infertile, the men are possibly infertile, but then also babies have high rate of mortality and are born, it seems, with birth defects. Now, again, there are not many mentions of this, so this is one of the reasons I wanted to mention it here, so that you will be on the lookout for it. When someone has a baby, there is great rejoicing, and then sometimes it's found later that they're what's called shredders, implicating and unbabies, that they don't have an identity, that they're not good enough, and that we're going to shred them, throw them in the garbage after they are born. Technology seems to have stopped in the 1980s, which is one of the problems with this book, and again, something I think that was updated very well in some of the adaptations. However, and I don't think I have it on here. Oh, I do. Some of the things to look for. 3 Mile Island is a fear that was... 3 Mile Island was a nuclear power plant that was shut down because they were worried that there was going to be a reaction. So the fear of nuclear power. DDT, which was a insecticide that had many negative effects, but also the digitization of money. And this is something that Margaret Atwood has said later on, and a year or two ago, that the digitization of money made Gilead possible. So Offred has a card. She goes to something that's sort of like an ATM, right? She tries to use her card and she is denied. And because people aren't really carrying cash or using cash, it is easier for the government to seize their assets. So the assets of women are taken away and given to their husbands, because now husbands own all the property and women aren't allowed to have property or carry money. And so that is something that we see in our society today, and something that I'd like you to be looking for in the book. So that's it for this portion of The Handmaid's Tale. We're going to pick up with a second lecture that digs a little bit more into the characterization and talks about some of the themes and motifs that I would like you to watch for as you read.